really isn't so much a question for the two of you, but I think really for the organizers and for all of us, that it all of a sudden dawned on me that when we think about the last 20%, are we thinking about the last 20% of everything, like the last 20% of electricity, the last 20% of industry, the last 20% of light-duty vehicles? I mean, you're shaking your head no, but I think that sort of the paradigm that actually I'm kind of guessing that everyone is bringing to this is not picturing what's going to be left on the table so much, but as thinking, okay, well, you know, it's more the last 20% of my domain as opposed to, you know, and so I think that as we think about pulling together the product from this meeting, I think we need to get clear in our heads, what do we mean by the last 20%? Where does it exist? Because how we frame solutions will be very different depending upon which way we do it.
Just to jump in quickly, right, going to this meeting, maybe, I think some of us in thinking about this have been a little electric-centric, and it looks like it might be like the last 75% would have been a better title for the meeting, because it's like...
Let me, I don't know if there's agreement. I think our thought was the hard parts of the decarbonization problem, whether or not that last 20 or 40% is equally hard in electrification or in transportation or in cement. I was personally thinking about the last 20 or 30% of carbon emissions, not by sector, but of wherever it is.
But I think the overall purpose of focusing on the last 20% is just to think about the end game and what you need to be doing now to get there. And so, you know, I think if you interpret it either way.
So I would just say, zero is zero and leave it at that, right? Because that's the target.
But if you only get 80% out of the electricity sector, and then we're electrifying everything, you know, we're already starting with a penalty.
And it doubles in demand, right?
Okay, just interjection on this one. I really would like to stress we have to go below zero because we are aiming for 500 ppm right now.
Yeah. Exactly. Okay, so anyone else want to comment on Sally's comment here, or else is next?
So before we move on, because I think that that's a really great point. It may be worthwhile. I don't know if you guys would agree to actually try to just list what is the perception about what those last 20% are. So yeah, cement for sure, shipping and air, but probably there is a consensus. Does that get us already just to 20%, or what are the other things that are likely to be in that bucket? Yeah.
Okay, Klaus.
So, I just had a quick comment on that. I mean, I think even looking at the shape of the curve, you know, if we're looking at, I don't know how you would measure this, but level of difficulty and decarbonization percentage, you know, what does that curve look like? Is it monotonic? Is it not? Is it non-monotonic? You know, maybe things get easier, then they get hard. Maybe it looks different across different sectors. It could be interesting, just this is directed toward Matt. I don't know if you guys have your questions all fixed, but it could be interesting to ask a question. I would love to see what, you know, people think about this. It's obviously very difficult to quantify, but.
And just adding super quickly to that, the sort of framework that Sonia has on the McKinsey stuff with the mitigation supply curve already hints at exactly that. And that's where I get worried about the transportation sector, because if you look at the stack that is in there, even for the potential for this, at reasonable prices, it's quite tiny.
Can I just add really quickly?
Oh, sorry.
But I mean, just, you know, that abatement cost curve doesn't take into account technological innovation.
That's right.
And so that's a big missing aspect of that. The model is it gets more expensive and more difficult over time to decarbonize, but that's not the case. And you know, we see very notable counterexamples to that, where it actually gets cheaper over time to cut emissions. And this is a message that, you know, influenced negotiators in Paris and sort of emboldening them to commit to emissions. But it's not the case across the board, right?
and largely ignores behavior and usage.
Well, right. Does that
So,
get
yeah.
easier or right, or more difficult?
Okay, Klaus.
So I have three questions which sort of bundle up, and they sound a little bit like just clarification, but I think they go beyond clarification. So the first one, you sort of suggested that automation can change the game, and maybe it accelerates electrification. I would nearly ask the opposite. If you really get nearly 100% utilization out of a vehicle, do you really want it to sit and charge, or even have to drive back to a point where it can exchange batteries? Because now time is money. The second question is, do you really think things will go down vehicle miles if I can use my iPhone and go anywhere, anytime, and possibly ask my car to buy me a six-pack of beer without me being in it?
The answer is no one has any idea. If you look at all the studies, they range from minus 60% to plus 80%, because a lot of it comes down to what are the incentive patterns, what is the policy. I mean, you can have automated vehicles where I would live in Aspen and drive to Denver, or I would sit in my office and let the car circle around until I'm finished with the business meeting. We'd have zero occupant vehicles. We worry about single occupant. We'd have zero occupant. So there's the debate has been characterized as there's the heaven or hell scenario, and there's a lot of unknowns about behavior. There's a lot of unknowns about cost, and there's a lot of unknowns about policy. And the real answer, so I'm committed, so I'm actually running a conference in November where we're going to develop the policy strategies to make sure we head towards heaven instead of hell.
Let me add one more. Yeah.
It's still on the same point, but I'll just highlight. Well, I'll second Dan that it's the results in the literature are really all over the place and very speculative actually. But I would urge the group to look at the work from Costa Samaras has been doing some quite neat work trying to quantify the effects under different types of market mechanisms.
I'm afraid I'm in the camp that Jevons is well and alive, but
yeah.
But my last question, which relates to this too, is assume that your liquid fuel is carbon neutral, or CO2 didn't really matter, and you now have a choice. Would you stick with your all-electric battery car, or would the plug-in really have an advantage? I'm just curious how that plays out. I have a suspicion the all-electric car with electric motors has an advantage. But having generating power on board would actually be helpful. That's my prejudice. But I'm curious of your two opinions on this.
I think the simple answer is that for small vehicles with short distance expectations, batteries are fine, even good. As the vehicles get larger, fuel cells become relatively more attractive, and then you end up at the top where you need dense liquid fuels. And the boundaries, it's a spectrum there. The boundaries are very fuzzy and depends on cost and a lot of other factors.
So one of the assumptions that I heard or outlooks that I really question is this small percentage of electric vehicle penetration and the small rate at which it would go up. And the reason I question that is I've had solar panels on my roof for 3 years, and I've driven an electrical vehicle for 3 years. And regarding your study, I drive more miles with my electric vehicle than I did with my gas BMW because it's more fun. I like it. It's quieter, smoother, and it's nice knowing the sun's powering me. And so when I look at the economics of it, and I look at how much it costs to put those solar panels on my roof, and I say, yeah, over 76,000 miles, I am getting 3 miles per kilowatt hour very consistently. So I said, for $5,000 to $7,000, and this was a couple of years ago, it's probably cheaper today, I could put enough solar panels on my roof, and if they last 30 years, which they're supposed to, and maybe even longer, I can get 450,000 miles of travel for $5,000 to $7,000 with solar panels. That's 3 cars, 150,000 miles a car or something. And so I say, boy, if more Americans knew that, if you just spent $5,000 now, you'd have free fuel for life, that equation, say, but all right, I can't put panels. So you talk to a millennial. I don't live in a house. I can't put panels on my roof for $5,000, even with the subsidies and so forth. And I can't have them follow me around, right? So you look at a business model like Tesla, and you said, what if Tesla said, when you buy a car, if you'll pay an extra $5,000, I'll construct utility-scale solar in the Mojave Desert, and I'll give you electricity to travel 15,000 miles a year for life. If you want to add $5,000 to purchase your car. And by the way, I'll put charging networks all over America so you can access that easily. How many Americans would do that? I know I'd do it in a heartbeat. So my wife, who was a huge skeptic on electric vehicles, deposits down the Model 3 because she wanted to. My brother deposits down the Model 3. My best friend. So people who were very skeptics, not adopters, once they've driven around in my Tesla for a while and they see it, they can't wait to get a Model 3 as 400,000 others just right out of the bat. So if a car company offers a model like that, or if there's multiple car companies, I think people are going to want them like hotcakes, like cell phones versus flip phones. But everybody in the transportation sector seems skeptical, like, no, we're only going to have 5% electric vehicles in 30 years. I think the demand's going to explode. So tell me why I'm wrong.
So remind me, you live in California?
Yes.
Right. So the,
You know how many Teslas there are all over the country, though? It's not just California.
So overall, I would love to have the same optimistic vision, but really looking at the rate of adoption of technologies and looking even at cases from drawing from energy efficiency, from PV adoption, and so on. Even if there is money on the table, there are several different things that will prevent the adoption from occurring quickly. Those include capital constraints for many folks, even if the operating costs of then driving the car are going to lead to overall benefits, right? So people will have that initial barrier. You find that both in efficiency and in transportation, they may be using mentally some mental model for the decision making that represents implicit discount rates of 300%. So they really want to see the benefits very, very, very quickly. So I think the pace of adoption, it may be accelerate a little bit from the numbers I mentioned, which are from the EIA, which are always wrong in any case, right? So those projections are always going to be off. But I would caution about being overly optimistic about the rate of adoption.
So what percentage of cars today?
Hold on a second. We're going to only allow one question from now on. Just try to make it through. You can keep that for the next one. Put your thing back up.
And I'll give them a one-sentence answer, is that it is probably true that there is some point where the market flips. And it's probably up around 25, 30%. Norway just hit 30% market penetration for EVs. So it'll be interesting to watch as they pull away. They have huge incentives as they pull them away. So conceptually, I agree with you. The question is, where is that point? But I think it's quite a ways off.
Okay. Nate?
A very quick for Dan, fundamental physics-based question. There are 3 biogeochemical cycles that could be used to make sustainable fuels. Water to make hydrogen, we heard about that. Carbon to pull it out of the air, to make liquid fuels, we heard about that. But we didn't hear anything about the third, which would be nitrogen to ammonia, which is much more abundant and a much easier proposition to remove from the air to make a valuable and principal liquid transportation fuel. So why haven't we heard anything about decarbonizing that sector with ammonia?
Because we're not talking about the carbon intensity. Joan is going to answer that question. Right.
Is it impractical engineering to think that we can't do it, or we're just not focusing on it because of the shorter-term technology on biofuels and on hydrogen, and we just kind of haven't gone through the question is whether it's engineeringly not feasible to power these things, ships and heavy-duty trucks and aircraft off of ammonia, or is it we just don't know how to make the fuel well yet?
I don't know about the second part. The first part is that what we've learned is that making major technological changes, I'll just say in the transportation sector for now, is very difficult, even traumatic. And so back 10 years ago, 12 years ago, it was thought that hydrogen had actually become considered the preeminent, premier, first choice fuel going forward. And in many ways it could have been, but then people started realizing not only would you have to transform the vehicle, you'd have to transform the energy supply system, and that was too hard. And so everyone veered toward electricity because the electricity existed. So that's half the answer, and then I'll leave Joan to answer the second half of the question.
Okay, so let's go from there.
Okay, so my question is for Ines. You mentioned the Midwest, which, as you mentioned, is the worst possible electricity supply mix from a decarbonization perspective. So if you look at all other regions of the US, you do see significant savings in switching from an internal combustion engine vehicle to a battery electric vehicle or a plug-in hybrid electric vehicle. So you mentioned that, I just wanted to repeat it. And so my question is, even in the Midwest, however, you mentioned that the plug-in hybrid electric vehicles, they don't provide savings as compared to the internal combustion engine vehicles because of the mode in which people are driving, or the, you know, whether they're using which part of the engine they're using. So I'm wondering, if you look at battery electric vehicles, on the other hand, in the Midwest, we wouldn't expect to see that change, or are you saying there's more highway driving? You know, I mean, of course there is, but I would say that, at least based on our work, if you look at the same model in the Midwest and you're charging with the Midwest grid, you still see some savings in going from, say, the Ford Focus conventional to the Ford Focus electric, or the Ford Focus hybrid. Although, you know, if you take into account that, you know, the issue you mentioned, that may change, but still you would see that savings from going to the electric.
So let me address that. So I guess first to the point of this maybe the worst grid, actually we can translate this to China and we'll have, you know, but in the United States for sure. In the second point, in terms of, you got it right in terms of the transition. One of the missing links there that is quite important is that the hybrid, not the plug-in, but just the traditional hybrid, actually has lower emissions in many cases versus the battery electric or the plug-in hybrid vehicles too. To your question, so there are three different effects that play out. And I believe, I'll double check the numbers, that when we included just the electricity mix and didn't include temperature and driving patterns, our results were similar to what you're just saying. When we incorporate, in addition to that, in addition to the electricity mix, the fact that the cold climates in those regions, and the fact that many of those are rural counties, and therefore you do have longer drives, that's what actually leads to the switch. I'll double check the numbers with
Because based on my numbers, it's a pretty close tie.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, as you start to decarbonize the supply mix, you start to see that
Yep.
differentiation come up. So anyway,
So let's compare the numbers, yeah.
I'd say that's the wrong way of even thinking about it. We are at 1% electric vehicles. It's going to be a long time before we get to 10%. The challenge is to increase the market penetration of electric vehicles with the understanding at some time we're going to have a far more efficient, far more low carbon vehicle, and we're going to have a decarbonized electricity system. You can't, everything I've ever come to understand about technological change is that you can't try to do everything at once. It's like this hydrogen story. You've got to think, and this is just as true for China as Ines was just suggesting, is in China, they should be doing electric vehicles, even though it's probably worse than gasoline, or it's the same as gasoline right now. But this is a slow process.
Yeah, I agree with you. I mean, we have to take into account innovation and, you know, jump-starting that process.
So I do get irritated with the academics that come up with all these studies that say, you know, anyway.
All right, that's good. You gotta know what you're doing. Okay, right over here, right over here.
All right, just have a comment for Ines. So on the natural gas for long-haul transportation, I had a conversation with John Wall, who was the former CTO. He recently stepped down at Cummins. So Cummins makes diesel engines and trucks and things like that. And he's very open-minded about cleaner fuels. And he brought up what he said the biggest barrier had nothing to do with the technology, but it had to do with a business problem. That long-haul trucks, a big part of the value proposition to the customer is the resale value, right, typically to a second or third world economy. And that the absence of the distribution chain for natural gas is what killed it for them. Otherwise, it was he didn't see any other barriers. Right? So.
Yeah, so I did hear similar comments from Cummins, and I think in associated with that is depending on what sorts of pathways we're looking at, the other critical driver is the infrastructure there for refueling those long-haul vehicles too, and how do you get to this issue, which relates with the issue that Joe was mentioning in a different setting, basically having the critical mass of vehicles and having the refueling infrastructure, which one comes first and how do you invest in both at the same time? Yeah.
Okay, Ken?
Dan, you'd mentioned electrifying highways, and I know they're doing this a little bit in Sweden. It would seem to me that it's a small additional cost to building the interstate highway system to building an interstate highway system with electricity available on it. And when I say this to people, they say, no, it would be ridiculously expensive. Do you have thoughts about electrifying the interstate highway system?
Yeah, actually, there's a bunch of young people at Stanford that have been bugging me about this for a few years. Again, this is what's best, optimal, and what's realistically attainable. You get into the problem of, they repave the roads every few years. Are you going to expect Caltrans or the local transportation agency to be respectful of these, wires you've put in the road? You have seasonal issues. In theory, it's great, and it probably in a lot of places it's plausible. But it's a solution to a problem of the past, really. So I was involved in major studies in the early 90s about electrified highways because batteries were so expensive. They were, $1,500, $2,000 a kilowatt hour. So this was a way of getting around the battery problem. It doesn't look like we're going to have that battery problem except for very large vehicles. And so it kind of makes it less and less compelling. And then when you have all of the infrastructure issues that go along with it, that the maintenance, it becomes tricky.
Doug?
So I have a question about framing, at least for some things. So when I think about transportation, or one can think about transportation, is in terms of services rather than just in terms of technologies. And so typically it's movement of people or goods, to be simple about it, right? And so I guess the question I would pose to each of you is, in the truck segment in particular, maybe some train and ship as well, but at least in the on land transport of goods, is there a way to completely rethink that? Because typically, particularly heavy duty trucks, it's fixed pathways. So I think of the Hyperloop, idea that Elon Musk has, and I said, well, maybe you should be running goods through that and not people. And that could be a completely different paradigm of how do you move goods around, at least for that, and then you can think about the last mile, et cetera. Is that worth looking into, or has there been some thinking about completely changing the modes for at least goods, and people are different, of course. So.
Yeah, I talked a little bit about it for people, except for your Hyperloop example, which I think is fanciful, but and especially for goods, because the whole point of the Hyperloop is fast transport, and goods, very few goods need to be transported fast, and right now we do them on planes. So the market for that, and that's point to point. We have a very diffuse land use pattern. The businesses, the factories are very diffuse. The delivery is very diffuse. So the problem you get into is we'd like to put in these fixed guideway systems that potentially are very efficient. You can come up with maglev designs, and you have pods, and there's a lot of ways of doing it more efficiently, but and I think for some of the long rail trips, there's some opportunity, but they've got the cost down pretty low on rail already, And if you start making them a little more efficient and a little lower carb, you make the electricity or the fuels lower carbon, it kind of, you kind of lose the incentive for doing it, and it's a small part of the total as well. So, in metropolitan areas, I think yes, where you have port, like in LA, you got the port and you got to get the stuff out there and you don't want all these trucks running around. I think there's opportunities there, but beyond that, it's probably pretty limited.
And I think you have a point, Doug, that the more careful analysis of that is lacking. I think some of the recent work out of Berkeley looked at the subset of that in terms of just mode shift for medium and heavy duty vehicles. I believe Taptish and Arpad Harvard, and that's as far as it has been done. Yeah.
And the catenary wires for trucks is part of that.
Yeah.
Wanted to ask a question on the topic of path dependency. And as you mentioned, rapidly developing urban areas in the context of achieving transformation. And having done way too much travel for IPCC, it seems like whether you're in Manila, Kampala, or Lima, it's a universal theme that the level of traffic is an impediment to economic growth and also presents substantial air quality issues. At the same time that the financial resources really aren't there to do the same sort of transformations that are hard, even in a US context. So how do you see the opportunities for transformation in these developing city areas?
You touch on the right point, which is financing is going to be the critical issue, and the design of policy incentives that will drive things in the right direction. And I think you should be the one talking a little bit more about this, but the development of the cities in itself, the pathways and the design that would be pursued would really depend on what state of the city urbanization is in and the degree of and pace of growth that is likely to happen in the next years, and start thinking about tailoring some of those solutions for those two aspects: the pace of growth, if it is already a widely developed city with at least the backbones of a public transportation system that could be expanded, versus designing something from scratch. Yeah.
We only have about 2 minutes, so we're going to try to go really quickly. And if you've already asked a question and feel like you can put it down, otherwise I'm going to go to Lee next and Paulina and Jishan.
I'll be as quick as I can. It seems like this is the stage in the discussion that we are framing.
No, but Chris was next. Chris has this, and then you're next. Sorry. Yes, Chris.
Yeah, thanks.
Yes.
Thanks so much. I wanted to ask about a different aspect of path dependence, essentially the point that Dan just spoke to and Jessica earlier about when you embrace the idea of going with a lower efficiency or a higher emissions approach because you're trying to build out a technology, or you have a good line of evidence that you're trying to build out a technology that eventually is going to click. And with all of the things we've been talking about when we talk about initial price barriers or technology barriers or secondary impacts barriers, those are things that are in some cases very likely to be susceptible to future technology developments, and especially at the early stages of implementation, you want to ask a serious question about to what extent should we really encourage an early adopter community that's taking these things on as part of the normal progress of technology development versus saying, oh, we don't want to deploy anything until the market is ripe for it in terms of it really producing a benefit. And I wonder how you think systematically about that rather than just as a one-off, oh, I don't like this one or I do like that one.
I'll come at it slightly different very quickly, is that in the transportation sector, we saw almost no innovation for 60, 70 years until really right now. And now we're seeing electrification of vehicles, automation getting pretty close, shared mobility. We haven't seen innovations like this in so many decades, and all of these go back to the path dependence, like which kind of innovations catch on, and those do because you're working with these sunk investments and the patterns. But I'll talk to you privately about more detailed what you said.
There is actually a way to quantify that and look at those trade-offs systematically. And so I think I disagree a little bit with Dan and Jessica in terms of I don't think it would be wise to do a completely full rollout of plug-in electric vehicles. But of course, you're going to have a time lag. So if nothing else, it will be extraordinarily important to understand what is the learning curve and the cost decline that is likely to occur, and quantify what's the penalty that we're willing to take on given that that transition is going to take time. So it's not that it shouldn't be done, but we should probably quantify what's the penalty associated with that.
Well, and it's not, it won't happen immediately, as you said.
Yeah.
Right? Because there are constraints to how quickly these things can grow anyway, right? Just naturally.
Okay, we got to get Lee in quick, and Ji-Chen.
So, as this seems to be the place that we are framing the transportation issue, and as with other issues, we can look at them with our departure point being some desired future or the present, and we can look at them nationally, and we can look at them globally. Both of you, I think, have used the present as a departure point, as your framework, and have been primarily focused on the US with some mention of global. I've recently done an analysis with Lou Fulton, who many of you know and was at the IEA for years, and also Nathaniel Green, where we looked at the global future quadrant. And I'd just like to briefly summarize that because I think it brings home some issues that haven't been brought out. Part of it is, as we look towards the future, we imagine, I think, a lot of complementary changes. And one of those is increased efficiency. So basically the approach we took was to say, let's assume that we make the transportation sector as efficient as we can across the board in the context of the IEA 2-degree scenario. We also found that by 2050, many of the technologies they were kinetically limited in terms of their market penetration to our best estimate. This includes hydrogen vehicles, and extensive electrification and efficiency improvements. And so, acknowledging the uncertainties, we extrapolated out to 2075 to get to closer to get less rate dependence. We assumed that if you could use hydrogen or batteries, you would in lieu of biofuels. That resulted in light-duty vehicles being almost exclusively hydrogen or batteries, buses, trains, half of heavy-duty trucks in our case. The only things that we assumed that biofuels would be used for were aviation, ocean shipping, which globally today and in the future is bigger than aviation, and 50% of long-haul trucks. I'm almost done. The result was that fully 50% of transportation was in this difficult to electrify category, partly because, as was mentioned, the efficiency benefits on the light duty side, the degree to which you can apply the efficiency lever is greater, 50%. And then we said, so what if the entire rest of the global economy had zero carbon emissions? And you said, no, that 50% of transportation, we're just going to leave it alone. It's too hard. It's going to continue to be supplied by fossil fuels. The result is that the emissions from that half of this future efficient transportation sector alone would be twice the emissions globally allowed for a 2-degree scenario. So you got to solve this problem. We have to solve this problem.
All right, I think that's a comment, and I can go to Ji-Chen.
Oh, okay. Okay, my question is very fast. When I think about ships, I think in military ships, aircraft carrier and submarine have been using nuclear propulsion for a long time. And is that simply impossible for civilian ships?
The answer is yes. Just a quick yes.
It's not impossible.
Not impossible. Okay. This is good. We're going fast.
So I guess I'm going to speak for the academics that annoy Dan, because I guess I'm one of those. So I don't think, so we've done a lot of work on electric vehicles and what the fleet looks like now, and I don't necessarily think we are arguing that we should not be doing electric vehicles, but I do think we have to be very careful about how we deal with these, because there are all these assumptions that, it's not going to be a problem because we are going to be decarbonizing our electricity sector at a faster rate than the deployment of the electric vehicles. And that may be the case in some places, but in other places, the electrification could bring new challenges to the decarbonization of the electricity sector. So I'm from Colombia, South America. If you go to any of the South American cities, air quality is a massive problem, and it's a problem of transportation. Most Latin American countries are heavily reliant on hydro, 70–80% of hydro. So a lot of our emissions are really transportation-based. And I've been looking at these, and we really are very interested in looking at the role of electrification in South America. That is bringing in an additional problem because hydro is no longer going to be viable in a lot of South American countries, and the growth of demand for non-electrification is increasing the constraints on the electric system. So vehicle electrification could also increase the constraints on the growth of the power sector and the ability of those countries to actually, some emissions may increase in those countries from the electricity sector with increasing demand and reduced resources. So we have to be very careful about how we say, well, we do electric vehicles, we can do that because we're going to be decarbonizing the electricity sector. That's the direction in a lot of places, but vehicle electrification could actually dampen efforts in the electricity sector.
Thank you. And I'm going to let Sally have the last word, if that's okay. Or you want to comment?
Just
okay,
one
yeah, please.
You know, it all comes down to policy, and what are we going to do with policy? And we've got to come up with simple answers because policy is simple. And if we try to get too sophisticated, it's not going to work. And so, I mean, that's kind of the value of the academia, is figure out what, at the end of the day, what really makes fundamental sense in the long term. Because the regulatory process, just as an example, is simple and flawed. For vehicles, we do it on tailpipe standards, and we're doing Band-Aids for electric vehicles now. We're going to have to change that whole structure, but you got to keep it simple. And so you got to figure out how much credit we're going to give the EVs. So what you say has relevance, but at the end of the day, you got to pick and make. You got to come up with simple answers and go with it.
But in some of these countries, it's not just policy. There are serious resource constraints, right? Natural resource constraints that need to be taken into account.
Yeah. But policy is going to determine how those resources are used.
You can have a sophisticated analysis and end up at a simple recommendation.
And that is
what we want, right? And to take into account all of these factors.
Yeah.
Okay, so the last word. So I think as we think about this, we're all, I think, in the same mindset that the world, and when we get to the last 20% to emit, to reduce, is going to be very similar to the world today. And I think that we really need to think about ways of significantly reducing transportation demand as a way to solve the problem. And, you know, I just quickly drew up a list, you know, like 3D printing for manufacturing. You know, maybe we're not going to be shipping all this stuff around. You know, the second thing, if we really got serious about sustainability, you know, our desire to consume so much stuff would go down. If we started buying and building more durable things, you know, the transportation demand would go down. And finally, you know, as we love this meeting, it's beautiful, we're in Aspen, but it takes a lot of time to travel around. I mean, if we really had excellent virtual reality, if you looked at the huge amount of business travel that goes on, you know, a lot of that could be reduced. So those might have nothing to do with transportation, but they could have a significant impact. So as we think about this last 20%, I think we need to sort of expand our circle of solutions to help us get there.
So I completely agree, and you're reiterating some of the solutions that I ended up concluding with. I do think that the 3D printing, the web conferencing, and looking at those types of solutions, and understanding the potential for producing locally would be the 3 next big things to look at.
Okay, we'll let Dan have the last word now.
Okay, so I just want to make, you know, a big thrust of this event is what are recommendations regarding R&D in particular. And I want to make a comment about that we bring a little sophistication to that. So in the transportation sector, the automobile industry, the companies are large, well-financed, they've got a lot of resources, a lot of capabilities. If we give the right policy signals to the automobile industry, they're going to be making the investments, and they are. They're investing billions and billions of dollars in battery electrics and fuel cell electrics. And then you go back, and so the role of government R&D there is actually pretty limited to some basic R&D with fuel cell, you know, some basic science and basic R&D on fuel cells and hydrogen storage. But then we go to like biofuels. And that's a case where I mentioned earlier is that there is no industry investing in it, and we need to think about R&D in a very different way with biofuels than we do with automotive technology. So I just saying as we go forward, let's not just say R&D and assume government is going to do R&D. In many cases, most of the R&D will come from the private sector, and we got to figure out how to make sure that happens.
And really quickly before I forget, there is one case for electrification that makes a lot of sense, and that should be going full speed right now, and that's in many countries in Europe, where you do see that the share of renewables is already large enough that really it's a non-brainer in terms of basically fuel imports, the actual GHG savings, and so on. So a little bit more attention could be paid to starting there, actually.
All right, thank you very much.